So let's just kind of take a minute and explain what I had in mind with the Bible class lesson. Is it's so easy for us to, categorize as, black and white and good and bad. It's just to realize that we're all people. We're all human. We have our good and our bad. And so, these individuals that we typically put up as great people of faith, it's easy to put them up on a pedestal. You have the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then David is a man after God's own heart. But as we know, they all made their mistakes. So from each of them, I'm hoping there's some things we can learn, some lessons, both good and bad. It's not all going to be, negative. It's also going to be some good lessons. And I'm just kind of hitting the highlights. If there's others that you can think of or that come to mind as we're kind of going through this, feel free to, speak up, let me know. I'm going to roughly kind of go in chronological order. So starting with Abraham. And I'm also, like I said, these are the highlights. We're not going to be able to hit everything. We just don't have that much time. And I also wanted to try to focus mainly on when these individuals were married and had their children. As we know, as we go into the later chapters of Genesis, there's stuff that happens with Jacob's children, Judah and stuff, when they're grown and their own children. But I wanted to more focus on, the family unit as far as, husband and wife and then children as they're growing up. And, they may be old enough to be able to do a little bit on their own. But the way I have it split up is Abraham's family. I have that ending when, Isaac is getting married and having his own children. Then I consider that Isaac's family and so on with Jacob and so forth. So the very first thing we see with Abraham, back when he was still called Abram, back in Genesis chapter 12, is God calls him to go to this land. He says, I'm going to give it to your descendants. I'm going to bless you and make your name great. And they go to the land of Canaan. But the very first thing we see after they get into the land of Canaan, there in chapter 12, is that there's a famine. And so Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt. And what does Abram do? He lies. He lies and says that Sarai is his sister. Why? He's afraid of what they'll do to him. She's a very beautiful woman. They'll kill me and take you. So he lies and tells her to lie. Say that you're my sister. And so they believe it. And so Pharaoh, takes Sarai, as far as doesn't do anything untoward with her, but takes Sarai. But then it says Pharaoh and his house were afflicted with great plagues. And so Pharaoh says, what have you done to me? You brought this evil on my house. And we see it's not the only time that this happens. Later on, similar thing happens with Abimelech. He's afraid what they'll do to him. You say that you're my wife. So the main thing we see here is that there's consequences to dishonesty. And we see the same thing later on with Isaac as well. He does the same thing. Tell them you're my sister, because he's so afraid of what they would do to him. So a couple of things here. There's definitely consequences to lying. The truth will always be found out. A lie is never going to last. But on top of that, one of the other big lessons from this is, he says lie. Say you're my sister because I'm afraid of what they'll do to me. When Abimelech found out that she was his wife, what did he say? All right, so yeah, Pharaoh said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? So that's what the Pharaoh says. But if you go down to, let me see here. It's chapter 20. It's with Abimelech here when, again, he does the same thing, does the same line. You think you would have learned. But he says it to Abimelech. Abimelech says, why did you do this? He says, I might have taken her. I might have slept with her. I might have done this evil. And Abraham says, I did it because I thought there's no fear of God at all in this place and they'll kill me. So it's also a lesson in making assumptions about people. Abraham thinks, well, we have to do this because, they're immoral and they're just going to kill me. But Abimelech says, I would have been with your wife. Here you have a man who, sure, he's not a follower of the Lord like Abraham, but even he can recognize this is wrong. They are married. I can't just take this woman. So it's also a lesson in understanding, maybe things aren't exactly the way that you thought they were. Any other thoughts on this first one with Abraham?
This is where I believe the phrase half-truth comes in. Sarah's actually half his sister.
That's true. Yeah, yeah. It's one of the things where, say this, and there's some truth to it, but the truth you're telling is leading people to a very false conclusion. Yeah, yeah. It's assumed to be this lie. Yeah. So, I mean, we think about what are the lessons we can learn from these things. One is, the consequences of dishonesty and the value of the truth. If he had just told the truth, things would have been fine. Things would have been okay. I mean, yeah, in Pharaoh's case, it's not until, God afflicted him with these plagues that he calls in Abram and says, what have you done to me? But especially in Abimelech's case, Abimelech didn't have to suffer all kinds of problems. He just finds out, and then he says on his own, what are you doing? If something could have happened, I could have been guilty of this. So it's this idea of, just tell the truth and you don't have to worry about it. Someone said one time, if you always tell the truth, you never have to remember anything. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of value in that. All right. And going through chronologically, you get to the very next chapter in Genesis chapter 13. Like I said, some of the lessons we learn from these families, because like us, they're imperfect. They are flawed families. Even though Abraham was this man of great faith, and there's so much that we praise him for, we know he wasn't perfect. He lied. He told his wife to lie. But in chapter 13, we have a very good lesson here about resolving conflicts. What was going on in Genesis chapter 13 after they've now come into the land of Canaan?
Basically, his herds and his nephew, I believe, Lot's herds, were just outgrowing, to the point where they were trying to consume the same ground, and there just wasn't enough room for all of them.
Yeah, yeah. Abraham, what we know of him, he's a good man and a man of great faith, but he was also a very wealthy man. He had flocks and herds. He had servants. He had a big household or entourage. And then he brought with him his nephew Lot, and Lot wasn't doing too bad for himself either. Lot had a lot of servants. They get there, they're having issues. So what's Abram's solution? How does he resolve the conflict? Yeah. He says, I don't want there to be any fighting. I don't want there to be any fighting. So he says, let's just separate ourselves. Let's just kind of go our separate ways. But the big thing is, he tells Lot, you look at the land and you decide where you want to go. Did he have to do that? No. He could have tried to put his foot down and say, well, I'm not going anywhere. And Lot, you're my nephew, and I love you. There's no reason for us to. They could have tried, firing all the servants. Well, it's them who are bickering. I don't have a problem with Lot. They could have blamed them and done. He could have done this any number of ways. But kind of like in the New Testament with Paul and Barnabas, when the sharp disagreement, sometimes you realize the best thing is for us to just put a little bit of distance between us. There's no reason to, dismiss all these men or whatever. Just go your separate ways. And then the way he goes about it is that he lets Lot choose first. Now, what was Lot's choice? The best in terms of watered and green, but the best happened to be yeah, near Sodom. So Lot makes his choice, and he makes his choice based off of what's going to be the best for farming and grazing and all of that. But we're told Lot, there's not a whole lot said about Lot, and it's easy for us to assume that he was a very flawed and imperfect man, which he was. But it's easy for us to say, well, Lot wasn't very good. The New Testament says that he was a righteous man, and it says his righteous soul was vexed because of living in Sodom day after day. So, criticize his choice for moving near Sodom? Absolutely. Criticize, certain things that he did? Sure. But Scripture says he was overall a pretty decent man, one whom the Lord saved from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So a good man, but who made a lot of bad choices, and as we see, had to live with those bad choices and live with the consequences of those bad choices. So a lot of problems there. But again, getting back to as far as Abraham's family and how he's dealing with things and the conflict that comes up, here you have a situation where these servants are fighting. It's going to get bad, maybe even violent. He says, you know what? Let's just go our separate ways. And Abraham even takes the high road and says, you know what? You pick first. I'll let you have the first pick. You take whatever part of the land you want, and then I'll take the other way. I'm willing to accept second pick. Abram's older. He's probably more wealthy. He has every right to just make demands, but he doesn't. And that's a big lesson in resolving conflict. And conflict, as we know, is something that's going to happen when you got families. Whether it's just two, whether it's just a husband and wife, or you got a whole house full of kids. Conflict is going to happen, and you have to try to be able to figure that out and find solutions. All right, anything else on Abram and Lot and resolving conflict here? Because, of course, it's going to come up as we keep going through. All right, so Abram is known as this man who is a man of deep faith. I mean, God calls him to go to Canaan. He doesn't question. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't bargain. He just packs up his things and he goes. But we do see, sadly, one of the things we can learn from these flawed families is a lack of trust in God. In what sense do we see Abram lacking trust in God? Okay, well, I mean, lying would be a lack of trust in God. He doesn't trust God to take care of him. He thinks that the people of Egypt and then the people in the land with Abimelech would kill him. But I'm thinking of something in particular. Yeah. So God had promised him, by the time you get to chapter 16, God had already called Abram to come to Canaan in the first place, told him he would greatly bless him, made this covenant with him that I'm going to give you descendants, you're going to have a son, this great nation, all of these things. You get to chapter 16, it says it hadn't happened yet. But Sarai happened to have this Egyptian handmaiden named Hagar, and so she says, use her, have a child with her. At its core, what's the problem here? All right, it wasn't God's plan. Yeah, so Sarai comes up with this idea. Hey, we're not having any children. Maybe you should do this. They didn't think to ask God. They didn't think to consult the Lord. Hey, Lord, should we do this? Is this your plan of how things are going to? They don't do that. She comes up with her idea. All right, I thought of this. Let's run with it. There's that. There's the fact that it's just impatience. We're not having children. We're not having children. And it's easy to understand why you would think we have to resort to doing something because we're getting on in years. If it hasn't happened yet, maybe it's not going to happen. So we can understand from a human standpoint this idea of, well, we have to try to find some kind of solution. But of course the problem is this is them thinking that they're going to solve what they see as a problem when it's God who promised it in the first place. If God told you you're going to have a son, if God told you you're not just going to have a son, but then through that son you're going to have all of these descendants, like the stars of the sky and the sand of the sea. If God's the one who promised that, why don't you ask God, hey, when is this going to happen? Why don't you consult the Lord? Why don't you, do that in any capacity? And we don't see them doing it. And so he has a son, he has Ishmael with Hagar, and as we know, that leads to even more conflict. We talk about the idea of resolving conflict, solving problems. Well, yeah, they have Ishmael, but then that leads later on to there being conflict between Sarai and Hagar, and between Ishmael and Isaac, and then later on down the road we see Ishmael's descendants. It's going to cause strife, all because they thought, well, God said it was going to happen, but it's not happening. So it's a lack of trust in God. And like we said, it's Abraham. It's this man of great faith. But even he had moments. And of course, not just him, but Sarah as well. When she's told that she's going to have a child, she laughs. This is an angel of the Lord, announcing this news, but still, she laughs at it. Because they, at that moment anyway, didn't trust in God. And of course, we can all sympathize with that. There have all been moments in our lives where our faith isn't as strong as it should be, where we don't have the level of trust as we ought to. But of course, the problem is that you would stay in that situation. But no, they had their moment where they didn't trust in God. But then we get down here to chapter 22 of Genesis, and it's arguably maybe the biggest lesson about doing the opposite. Like we said, in these families we can find lessons both good and bad. So in Abraham's life with his family, we see a definite lack of trust in God, that they think, well, use the Egyptian handmaid and have a child by her because it's clearly not happening here. But you get to chapter 22, and what is Abraham called to do? Yeah. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him up as sacrifice.
That's something interesting too, that God uses the phrase your only
Your only son, yeah.
because Ishmael's
Right. Yeah, in God's eyes, this is your son because he's the son of promise and he's the one that this is going to happen through. And he says that not only to emphasize that, but also to say, if you do go through with this and kill Isaac, then that's it. But in this instance, what does Abraham do?
Follows along.
I mean, it's a lot like when God first called him to go to Canaan. We don't see Abraham saying, really, God, you want me to go here and do this? He doesn't question it. He doesn't try to bargain with God. Couldn't I do this instead? We don't see any kind of hesitation. God tells him to do it. Says he rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac cut the wood. They get ready and they go. When they're on their way, what does Isaac say? Yeah, we've got the wood. We got everything. Where's the sacrifice? What was Abraham's answer? Yeah, the Lord will provide. Throughout all of this, Abraham doesn't stop, doesn't hesitate. He trusts in God. Now, we don't know. It's not revealed to us, but it seems pretty clearly that Abraham thought that he could kill Isaac and then God would raise him from the dead. Because, he was ready. He had the knife in his hand. He's ready to kill him before he's told to stop. He gets right up to the point. And if that doesn't show a level of trust in God, then I don't know what does. So here you have a man who previously, he went out when God told him to, but then as far as we can see, right after they get into the land, they leave the land. Well, if God says that he's going to give you this land, shouldn't you stay in it? But at the first sign of trouble, a famine, which, don't get me wrong, I don't think many of us would stick around if there's a big famine going on, but at the first sign of trouble, you go down to Egypt. That doesn't seem to indicate a deep level of faith. And then you lie and say Sarah's your sister, and then you go and have this other child because you're not patient, you're not waiting on God. Here he has finally learned. If God says it, that's all I need to know. It's easier said than done, though, right? We're not going to be put in Abraham's situation and told to go and sacrifice a child, but there are some things that the scripture says, you go and you do this. Does that necessarily make it easy? No. Yeah. We're told in the New Testament that God's commands are not burdensome, and that's true. He doesn't ask us to jump through a lot of hoops. He could. God has every right. As he's the creator, we're the creation. He could put any kind of terms, any kind of stipulations on things. He doesn't, though. What he asks us to do, in the grand scheme of things, isn't that hard. Be honest, hardworking, love him, love those around us, but that doesn't mean that it's always easy. To love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, to, when you're struck on the cheek, to turn the other cheek, to not retaliate. It's not always easy. And we, a lot of times like Abraham and Sarah, we would think, well, why don't we do this and take the shortcut? Why don't you have a child with her? There doesn't seem to be anything happening. So the idea of just trusting in God. God said to do it this way. All right, that's what we're going to do. Sometimes that is a hard lesson to learn. But hopefully we can learn from Abraham and from these others and not have to learn it the hard way for ourselves. All right, anything else on these lessons from Abraham? Any others that you can think of in the life of Abraham? Any good, valuable lessons? Okay, because like I said, in these families we have some good, some bad. It's the idea. They're flawed. They're people of faith. These are the patriarchs. God spoke directly to them, gave them these promises, but we know they weren't perfect. We know they made a lot of mistakes. All right. So then we get to Isaac. Starts at about chapter 25. So Abram has one of his servants go and find a wife for Isaac. He goes, finds Rebekah, brings her back. Now Isaac and Rebekah are married. And what do we see here, beginning in chapter 25? They have 2 sons.
Esau and Jacob.
Yeah. Esau's the older. They're twins, but Esau comes out first. Esau is older. And then Jacob. And what are we told about their parents' relationship with him?
Playing favorites.
Yeah. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. does this mean Isaac hated Jacob?
So he just had more in common maybe
Yeah,
with Esau did.
yeah. It doesn't indicate a hatred, but it's certainly you have more in common with one. It specifically says he ate of his game. Oh, he's a good hunter. I like to eat, so there you go. So it doesn't have to be animosity. It doesn't have to be hatred, but clearly you have one parent favoring the other, and that's going to cause problems, as we can clearly see. All right? Now, I know I have it in the order on the handout here. I said playing favorites and then deceit and then lack of love and compassion. But let's fast forward to that one, because this is one of the main things here. Is there's no doubt that Isaac loved Rebekah, Rebekah loved Jacob, and they loved their children. There's no doubt about that. They loved one another, but at times they didn't have the kind of love for one another that they ought to have. And that's shown in the fact that they played favorites. And then what do we see when the very next thing at the end of chapter 25 with Esau and his birthright?
Just disregarded it and thought he was going to die of hunger anyway.
Okay, so the main thing we can say in this, because it is, it's referenced in other passages of Scripture of Esau being a carnally minded man, is that he didn't consider his birthright, is that he's willing to just trade it away for a meal. So I'm not letting Esau off the hook. He shouldn't have done that. It's very short-sighted, very foolish. Esau comes in, and it says he's exhausted. And he asks his brother for some of the stew, some of the pottage that he has. What does Jacob say? Yeah, sell me your birthright. You can't give your hungry brother something to eat? I mean, are we told that it's the very, bottom of the pot, and if I give you any, I won't have any for myself? I mean, maybe that's the case. We don't know. But I mean, your brother comes in and he's exhausted, and he asks you for some food, and maybe he's not asking nicely. Maybe he's demanding. We don't know. But you can't give him something to eat? You're gonna sit there and say, until you sell me your birthright, I'm not going to give you anything. You have to swear to me this first. I mean, it's a serious lack of compassion on Jacob's part. I mean, one thing we can credit Jacob for, he's very smart, very clever, very crafty. But I mean, this is your brother. And yeah, sure, they're old enough now. Esau's going out and hunting. Jacob's cooking. They're at least teenagers, if not, into their 20s. But still, I mean, shouldn't you have some kind of brotherly love, some kind of compassion for him? And it kind of hints at least it seems to be, we don't want to, put in the Scripture what's not there, but it kind of hints at they probably had a little bit of, animosity between them, a little bit of drama going on in the brotherly relationship, probably based on the fact that their parents played favorites. Because, I mean, if this is your brother whom you love, whom you're super close to, you're really just going to let him go hungry? But no, Jacob says, sell me some of your birthright. Esau, like we said, shouldn't have done it, but he agrees. He says, yeah, sure, fine. What use is it to me now? I'm about to die. Sells him his birthright. Jacob's happy, but it says Esau despised his birthright. So it takes two brothers that, from what we can tell, probably aren't on the best of footing in the first place. And now they're even worse because now there's resentment. So there's an interesting thing that we see here in chapter 26 is that, like we said, talking about lessons we can learn, things we can learn, consequences of dishonesty, is that Isaac does the exact same thing that his father did. Isaac is with Rebekah, and they go into Gerar, and he tells her to say that she's his sister, which we can say in this instance, like Chuck brought up before, is not a half-truth like with Abraham and Sarah. Rebekah was not his sister in any way, shape, or form. So they lie, and for the same reasoning. Well, we think these are godless people. They'll kill me, and they'll take you, and it's going to be bad. But what happens in this instance with Isaac and Rebekah? Does God send plagues? No, he doesn't seem to. So how do people find out that they're husband and wife?
Interaction between the two.
Yeah, they see an interaction between the two. Yeah, you get down to verse 8. It says Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out of a window and saw Isaac, depending on your translation. It says laughing with Rebekah, his wife, or sporting with Rebekah, his wife.
In the American Standard, I believe it says caressing.
Caressing his wife. So Isaac's there, and he lies. He shouldn't have lied. As we said, lying is wrong. It's a sin before God, and it always brings trouble. There's always consequences to dishonesty. But oddly enough, one of the good lessons we can learn about Isaac and Rebekah is that they're here in this situation where he's lied and said that she's his sister. You'd think that they would be taking steps to support the lie and put up this facade. But they can't keep their hands off of each other long enough to keep that going. So again, with Isaac and Rebekah, there's no doubt that they loved each other. No doubt that things were good. It's just you shouldn't have lied about it. And you knew how to love your husband and your wife, but then when it comes to loving your children, you're playing favorites. So a little bit of good, a little bit of bad. But then the other thing, sadly, is that, like we said, there's some good lessons to be learned from this, and there's some bad, is what we see here in chapter 27. So, we know Jacob, like we said, very smart guy, very crafty, very clever. We get into chapter 27. Here it says that Isaac is old and he can't see very well. And he tells Esau to go and hunt. And he says, you bring this back to me, I'll eat. And he says, I will bless you. Who's listening? Rebekah. Rebekah's listening. So where does she go? She goes to Jacob. Here's what we're going to do. You go and get, one from the flock. Bring this to your father. Let him bless you. Jacob says, that's not going to work. Esau's a hairy man. This plan isn't going to work. Notice he doesn't say, how can we do this? How can I disrespect and fool my father? He doesn't have a problem with that. He's just worried that the plan's not going to work. My brother's a very hairy man. Well, go and take some of the skins of the young goats. We'll do that. So they go to Isaac, and Isaac still, he doesn't seem to be fooled so quickly. Because he first hesitates when Jacob comes in and says that he's Esau. How did you find this so quickly? You were supposed to go out hunting. I figured it'd take you a while. You're back awfully fast. So first he is questioning that, but then he says, the voice sounds like Jacob. So yeah, he can't see all that well, but something seems a little off here. Then he feels the skins of the goats, and then Jacob just flat out lies. Are you really my son Esau? He answered, I am. Fooling his father, tricking his father, taking the blessing. Of course, the difference between the blessing and the birthright would just be the physical inheritance. The firstborn would receive a double portion. The blessing here is the idea that it's this one who's going to be, receiving the covenant and the promise from God, and this, great blessing on top of that. So now they go and they steal it by deceit. So, again, here you have this family. Is there any doubt that Isaac loved Rebekah? No. And Rebekah loved Isaac? No. They seemed to work pretty well together. And did they love their children? Yeah, they did. But they played favorites, which caused problems, set the boys at odds with one another. And then, because she favored Jacob so much and wanted him to receive the blessing, did she go and try to talk to her husband and say, hey, Isaac, why don't you bless Jacob? No, she doesn't do that. She's going to trick her husband. If she really loved her husband, is this something you do to someone you love? And to kind of pull the rug out from under Esau? That now he's not going to receive this blessing, which his father meant to give to him? If you really loved Esau, would you do this to him? So it's one of these things where we know they loved each other, but boy, they had a hard time showing it. And they really made a whole lot of mistakes when it comes to showing just the basic level of compassion here, of what they need to be doing as a family. And then, of course, we know the problems that this caused. Esau already despised his birthright. He already didn't like Jacob. Well, after this, he's ready to kill him, to the point where they have to send Jacob away. Otherwise, his brother's gonna kill him. So all it does is cause more problems down the line. So it's very similar to, like we said, the consequences of dishonesty. Well, the consequences to deceit. Here you are, let's fool this person, let's pull this prank on him. It's not going to go the way you think it is. Yeah, Jacob received the blessing. You accomplish that in the short term, but long term, it's going to cause so much strife, so much drama and anger and sorrow in this family that is it worth it? And of course we know it's not. And this isn't how you treat your spouse, your children. This isn't what you do when you truly love someone. All right. Anything else through Isaac here and his family?
It kind of almost seems like Rachel cares more about Jacob and, setting him up for his life than what she does for her own husband, where she's willing to deceive Isaac in order to make sure Jacob's taken care of.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be something like that she's, thinking, well, we're older now, our life is, more or less, we're on the downhill slope, but, I want to set Jacob up for a good future, that kind of thing. And maybe she's remembering how when she was pregnant, they were told that the older would serve the younger. So in her mind, perhaps, and we don't know, but maybe that's how she's justifying it to herself. Well, it was told that, so in her mind, well, Jacob's supposed to receive the blessing. Okay, if that's what you think, and I mean, clearly from Scripture, that seems to be that was God's plan. But you could have, again, she could have went and talked to her husband. He could have went to Isaac and said, hey, don't you remember this? You should probably bless Jacob. Make your case for that. But no, she does it in this underhanded, lying way, gets Jacob to go lie to his father. Is this really the way you want to go about it? Certainly not. All right, so anything else through Isaac and Rebekah? Yeah.
The interesting thing in the story is it says Jacob loved Rebekah, but it never says Rebekah loved Jacob anyway.
Now that is a good point. Yeah, it says,
Say he loved her.
yeah, he loved her.
It was an arranged marriage that she was probably a teenager when she married him. And it doesn't say anywhere in the scriptures that she loved him. Interesting.
It is interesting, yeah, and it definitely speaks a lot about the wisdom of arranged marriages and things like that. Yeah. All right. Anything else? All right. So, at this point, as we know, Isaac and Rebekah are still alive, but I want to shift over to Jacob because I'm splitting this up into the distinct family units because when this person is married, now that's their family. And the husband is to leave father's mother and cling to his wife. So now we get to Genesis chapter 29, and we have Jacob getting married and then beginning to have children. And immediately, what's the problem?
Young one's a better deceiver than him.
Yeah, Jacob kind of gets his comeuppance. He faces a lot of karma in his life. Is that this man who was the deceiver and he tricked others, now he's tricked. Laban puts in Leah instead of Rachel. Well, what's this going to do for that household and that marriage relationship? Yeah, a lot of problems. I mean, just from the get-go, because it's not what God intended. God had marriage designed as one man and one woman for life, and that's how it's supposed to be. Well, now he has these two wives. And in addition to that, the one wife wasn't the one that he chose. And you can't help but feel sorry for Leah. She's put in this position by her father. She feels pressured, forced into this, and now she's stuck with a man who doesn't love her. They have a lot of kids together, but clearly they weren't as intimate as they should have been or would have been. And she knows he loves her sister more. So from the very get-go, we see again playing favorites, just like Isaac and Rebekah did with their two boys. Now we have a favorite wife and then one who's just kind of there. And then on top of it, because they compete with one another over the playing favorites, then the two other handmaids get involved. So now you have 4 women, all with Jacob, all having children by him. It's just going from bad to worse. And we'll skip ahead a little bit in the timeline here because it also falls under the category of playing favorites. So not only did Jacob have a favorite wife, but then what do we see with his children? Favorite son. Joseph was the favorite son. That didn't cause any problems, right? Joseph is the favorite son. Well, we know how his brothers felt about that. They threw him in a pit, were going to kill him, and then sold him into slavery. All because his father loved one more than the others. Now, there's no doubt that Jacob loved his children. He provided for them. He loved his children and loved his wives in a sense. We know there's no doubt how much he loved Rachel. They had a closeness. They had an intimacy. They were a family unit. But man, the lack of compassion going on here is just astounding to behold. And all because you favor one over the other. And sure, we can say there's some extenuating circumstances here. That, well, Jacob never wanted Leah in the first place. He got tricked into this. It's not his fault. Okay, that's fair. Laban shouldn't have done what he did. But once Jacob's in that situation, you kind of have to take the hand that life deals. You kind of have to make the best of it. And he certainly didn't. And he sees what's going on. I mean, one thing we could say about Jacob, again, he's not a dumb guy. He's very smart. He's very clever. He knows full well all the drama and all the competition that's going on between Rachel and Leah and the handmaids, and he seemingly doesn't know anything about it. He's just, settle that amongst yourselves. He's not trying anything to try to, like Abraham did with Lot, to resolve conflict. He just lets it continue. It's not a good situation. But then we do see an interesting situation here in chapters 32 and 33. So as we know, Jacob was sent away because they were afraid that Esau was going to kill him. So he goes and meets with Laban and lives there for at least 8 or 9 years, a long time. He worked 7 just for Rachel. Oh yeah, and then he worked, so at least 14. Right. Right, and Laban continued to deceive him and cheat him. So, but then he decides, I'm going to go back. I'm going to take my wives, my children, I'm going to go back. Laban still even tries to stop him there. They go back. On their way, who does he know he's going to run into? Esau. This brother whom he made sell him his birthright. And so he already despised his birthright, didn't like Jacob on account of that. And then cheated him out of the blessing. Last he saw of him, last he heard of him, he was going to kill him probably. So he goes to meet Esau. How does Jacob go about this? Well, okay, yeah, when he goes and presents his family, yeah, he puts them in the front and then Rachel in the back. But aside from that, how does Jacob deal with meeting Esau? All right, so when they do finally get to one another, he runs up and kissed him. But he mentions the fact there in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 32, he sent messengers before him to Esau. It says, thus you shall say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have sojourned with Laban, I have oxen, donkeys. I have sent to tell my Lord in order that I might find favor in your sight. So he sends a messenger, calls him Lord, says, I've been blessed, I have this. He comes bringing gifts. He humbles himself before Esau. But he doesn't just assume, I'll just give him this present. That'll make all the drama and the years past. It'll make all that baggage go away. No. He says, he thought, I may appease him. This is down in verse 20. I may appease him with the present that goes ahead of me, and afterward I shall see his face. Perhaps he will accept me. So even then, he's not just assuming. He's like, I don't know what's going to happen with Esau. But he's doing everything he can. There in verse 3 of chapter 33, he himself went on before them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. So it seems like he finally learned his lesson. Now maybe he's just doing this out of self-preservation because he's afraid Esau might still try to kill him. Very much a possibility. But at the very least, we can see he's trying to solve the problem. He sees where there's an issue here and he's trying to nip it in the bud. And he ends up reconciling with his brother, at least as much as they can. You can't erase the past. You can't undo what's been done. But we certainly see a lesson here. And okay, I know how bad things were before, but he doesn't want things to continue to be that bad. He doesn't want to be at odds with his brother. Now he's got wives. He's got children to think of. Let's see if we can settle this. And whatever that takes, me humbling myself, giving him gifts, I'm willing to do it to bury the hatchet. Again, say what you will about Jacob. Certainly a flawed man, but that's a good lesson for us. All right, anything else? All right, thank you so much. I knew we wouldn't